Hello, welcome to my course. And in this course, we will learn about Spring Boot, an extension of Spring Framework that helps developers create simple, web-based application quickly by eliminating boilerplate configurations. My name is Lucy, and we will be going through some basic fundamental concepts of Spring Boot together. This training is for people with good background on Java and have a basic understanding of the Spring Framework. As we go through these concepts, we will have some hands-on exercises, and these are the tools which should already be installed in your working machine. A Java JDK version 8 and up, IntelliJ IDE, and a Maven version 3 and up. Some of the major topics we will be talking about are Spring Boot overview. We will talk about the benefits, the features, and we will also try to set up a basic Spring Boot application. We'll also talk about the Spring Boot Model View Controller, Spring Boot Data JDBC for data access while still retaining the special traits of the underlying data store. We will also try to build a sample RESTful web applications. We will also talk about Spring actuators and how to enable them. And we will also implement Spring Boot test. At the end of this course, you should have enough foundational knowledge to create Spring Boot applications. We will try to build a simple customer registration application, a RESTful service, as we learned each concept. So what is Spring Boot and how is it related to the Spring Framework? Spring Boot makes it easy to create standalone, production-grade, Spring-based application that you can just run. But what is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot? In simple terms, the Spring Framework offers extensive infrastructure assistance for creating Java applications. It is packed with great features such as dependency injections and out-of-the-box modules such as Spring MVC, Spring JDBC, Spring Security, Spring AOP, ORM, and Spring Test. These modules can significantly cut down the development time of an application. Spring Boot is basically an extension of the Spring Framework, which removes the boilerplate configurations required for setting up a Spring application. Spring Boot offers some great features, and we will go through each of them. Spring Boot helps us create standalone Spring applications with embedded server, so we don't have to manually deploy WAR files. We can just run our web app using the embedded Tomcat server. Spring Boot also provides starter dependencies that simplify dependency management of a Java project, so no more dependency mess or dependency versions mismatch. Spring Boot also has automatic configuration of Spring and third-party libraries. Furthermore, Spring Boot provides production-ready features such as metrics, health checks, and externalized of configuration. Let's talk about starter dependencies. Before, Spring developers used to spend a lot of time on dependency management. Starter dependencies are introduced to help solve this issue. Spring Boot starter dependencies are a set of convenient dependency descriptors that you can include in your application. These starters are pre-configured with the most commonly used library dependencies, so you don't have to search for the compatible library versions and configure them manually. Spring Boot provides a number of starter dependencies for different Spring modules. These are some of the most commonly used ones. Now let's look at the minimum dependency required to create a web application using the Spring Framework. With the Spring Framework, we need to include two of these dependencies, both the Spring Web and the Spring Web MVC, to support a web application. Unlike Spring, Spring Boot requires only one dependency to get a web application up and running, so we only had to include Spring Boot Starter Web in our dependencies. Spring Boot Starter Web dependency automatically includes the following: Spring MVC, REST, Tomcat, and Jackson. These are some of the technologies that we need when we try to develop a web application. And Spring Boot Starter Web automatically includes these four. In a modern-day Spring application, which uses Java-based configuration, You need to add the following two methods in your configuration class. This is not really complex for someone who has done Spring development, but if you are starting afresh, then it can take hours and days to figure this out. But more importantly, this is a piece of code which many of us have written irrespective of our application. This is what we call the boilerplate configurations. That's where Spring Boot auto configuration comes into the picture. It detects the presence of a certain class in the class path and then automatically configures it for you. For example, if you have added JDBC template into your class path and also H2 jar, then Spring Boot can automatically configure an in-memory database for you and a JDBC template which is ready to use. So you don't need to write these codes to use JDBC template in your DAO layer. You need to opt in to auto configuration by adding Enable Auto Configuration or Spring Boot application in your class. Now let's talk about Spring Actuator. Actuator is mainly used to expose operational information about the running application, your health, metrics, info, dump, environment, and etc. It uses HTTP endpoints or JMX beans to enable us to interact with it. The main benefit of this library is that we can get production-grade tools without having to actually implement this feature ourselves. Once this dependency is on the class path, several endpoints are available for us out of the box. As with most Spring modules, we can easily configure or extend it in many ways. Embedded Servlet Container. As a default, Spring Boot web application contains the embedded Tomcat container as a transitive dependency. In other words, the Spring Boot Starter web transitively pulls the Spring Boot Starter Tomcat dependency. The advantage with this is you don't need a server to be pre-installed in the development environment. The Spring Boot framework supports 3 different types of embedded servlet containers. We have Tomcat, Jetty, and Undertow. Embedded servers are quite scalable and can host applications that support millions of users. So what have we covered so far? So far, we've talked about how Spring Boot is just an extension of a Spring framework. We looked at some Spring Boot features such as the starter dependencies that are starter packs that include all the dependent libraries you need. We also talked about automatic configuration that automatically configures the application based on libraries added to your class path. We also looked at actuators that allows us to manage and monitor our applications. We also talked about embedded servlet container, which allows our web application to be deployed and just run. For the next session, we will be setting up a simple application. There are 3 ways to create a Spring Boot project. We can either use a Spring Initializer, a Spring Starter project, or a Spring Boot CLI. In the next session, I will show you how to create a Spring Boot project using the Spring Initializer, and we will do some hands-on. See you!